Alright, let's take a look at some more verbs. We've already learned the five finite or fully inflected conjugations for the Hebrew verbs. The perfect, imperfect, vav consecutive, imperfect, the vav plus imperfect, and the vav consecutive perfect. And that does a lot for us. That gives us all the basic verbs that we need to begin telling a story, to telling a narrative. But there's a lot more that verbs can do. Um, they can, they can be commands. They can. We need to sometimes use verbal nouns or verbal adjectives, and that's what these other conjugations will give us. Um, we're going to look at three different categories. One being the volitives. Volitives are those things that express a wish or a desire or a command. We've got the jussive, the imperative, and the cohortative. We've got two infinitives, the construct and the absolute, infinitive construct and infinitive absolute, and we've got both the active and passive participles. We'll look at all these in turn. So the volitives, they're also sometimes called modals, and they are the verbs that express wishes, desires, or commands. The imperative will express a command or an instruction in the second person. A jussive expresses a desire in the third person, and the cohortative expresses a desire in the first person. And so they are not fully inflected like the rest of these. These are all built off the imperfect, but they are not fully inflected. Each one has its own person, and it exists only in that person, such as the imperative. As you can tell, or you may or may not be able to tell, it's essentially the imperfect with the first consonant cut off, and so that prefix that is on the front of the imperfect is lopped off, and those become imperatives. Again, it appears only in the second person. It is a speaker giving direction, instruction, or a command to a second party. So we see it appear in the second masculine singular, the second feminine singular, the second masculine plural, and the second feminine plural. And we'd parse these just like we would any other verb. That first one, katol, we would parse that as a cal imperative, second masculine singular from katal. Here we can see a series of imperatives and how they're used. In this case, we've got three: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That is the three verbs there. They're all giving direction to the newly created image bearers of God. It's God speaking directly to them. So it's all in the second person. You notice it, all three of these are actually in the masculine. These verbs are masculine verbs. Because when you're addressing a group of people, even if it's just two, if they're of mixed gender, typically you see the masculine verbs used there. And so we have three second person masculine plural verbs. You'll also note there's no explicit subject stated here. It doesn't say, Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The you is, or the y'all in this case, is implied, just as it would be in English. We understand it perfectly in translation without actually having to explicitly state the subject. The form of the verb being an imperative makes it clear that the subject is you. Sometimes imperatives will be followed by this particle na. If you look it up in your lexicon, it's going to say something like please. And that, it may just be a form of polite address rather than demanding someone do that. Would you please do this? That's not always the case. It may just be a grammatical convention, though, because, if you look at this example right here, this is God speaking to Abram. He's telling him to go outside. He's not asking him politely. This is the divine creator speaking to one of his creations. He doesn't need to say please. But in this case, it's left untranslated. So that is a particle you will occasionally see following imperatives. You'll also note on this that it says there, look toward heaven. The imperative is that first word there, habet, so habet na. But there we have hashemayim ah, and you may remember from the last lecture that that comet's hay is the directional ending. And that's where we get not look at heaven, but look toward heaven. It's showing a direction at that point, and that's that directional ending in action. So just a call back to our previous lecture, reinforcing that information. We talked about how to negate sentences with the particles lo or al. What we did not talk about was how to negate commands. And imperatives typically do not have one of these negative particles in front of them. If you are giving a negative command in Hebrew, you actually still use the imperfect. As far as translation value, it fits. Rather than saying, do not look back, you could say, you will not look back. It sounds like a declarative statement, but with enough emphasis, it becomes a command. You will not look back. And so that's what we see in this case. The al is actually appended to the imperfect verb there, not an imperative. So that's how we negate commands in biblical Hebrew. The cohortative, as we said, was the first person volitional. While the imperative is always directed to the second person, the first person is essentially said to oneself. And so as we say, look at this case in Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image. Now in this case, of course, it's prompted a bit of theological discussion because it's God speaking to himself, or as some people have interpreted it, that it is God speaking amongst his divine counsel. But in this case, it's not really a declarative statement of, we will make man in our image. It's actually, let us make man in our image. It's expressing the desire, not the fact of the making. You'll see that this is actually, a cohortative is going to take on the same form as the imperfect. Actually looks just like an imperfect, except it fronts the sentence. Normally, imperfect verbs will be following or later on in the sentence, not Vav consecutive imperfects. We're very used to those being right up front in the clause. First sentence in the clause, Vav consecutive imperfect. But with cohortatives, if we see just a bare imperfect at the front of a clause, might well be a cohortative if it's a first person, whether that's plural or singular. Obviously, you don't have to think too much about that because Logos will identify these for you as cohortatives. Here we have the final of our volitionals, the Jussive, and that's really expressing not to a person, but about a person. Between a speaker and a listener, they are wishing that a third party would perform some action. So in this case, in Genesis 16, may the Lord judge between me and you. It's not demanding that the Lord do it. It's not even requesting of the Lord that he judge. But it's simply saying to a second party, I hope that this third party does this. I hope that the Lord judges between me and between you. Like the cohortative, it takes the form of it's the same form as the imperfect and will often appear first in the clause. Again, the Logos software will identify these for you as Jussives. Those are our modals. Moving into infinitives. Infinitives, generally speaking, are verbal nouns. They are not inflected for person, number, or gender. They are bare nouns. It is the noun in and of itself. In English, our infinitives are, we often put to in front of them. So, to be, to run, to laugh, to speak. Those are infinitives in English. But we only have one type. We just have one type of infinitive. Hebrew has two, which is rare in a language: the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute. Just like the other verbs, just like the imperfects and the perfects and the volitionals, they will have a stem. It will be in the cal, the nifal, the pl, and so on, but it will not have any other inflection for person, number, or gender. And therefore it doesn't reflect tense or aspect. And so we will see how that plays out in these translations. As I said, in English, an infinitive to kill. It can also be a gerund, killing. Killing is not inflected for person, number, or gender. It's just the base, bare verb by itself. No indication of tense or aspect in there. One of the things once you jump into these is they're flexible enough and they're used in enough cases that you may have to start referencing your grammars to really figure out what and how they're being used. We've got the biblical guide, the Biblical Hebrew a Compact Guide. We've got the pages there. In your logo software, you'll also have Frederick Putnam's Hebrew Bible insert. Just searching that in your resources, it has several articles on these sorts of things. 2.2.6 is the infinitive construct, so jump to that and take a look at it. It'll give you some translation aids there. One of the most common ways you're going to see it is the infinitive construct is with an inseparable preposition, and we've seen that before. Most common with la, sometimes with ba, but most common we'll see this with la, because at that point we're translating it much how English infinitives already exist, to kill. And that can act as a verbal noun. We could have the subject of a sentence. To kill is wrong. At that point, the infinitive in English, to kill, is the subject of that sentence. So if I said, to kill is wrong, I'm using that infinitive as a verbal noun. Likewise, and by no means don't take this to heart, I do not mean it, but if I said, I want to kill you, that to kill would be the object of that sentence. What do I desire? To kill you. Again, sorry we have to use that paradigm there, but you get the point. Here you see a much less violent example, although this sentence takes place within the context of some violence in the biblical narrative. Here you see the preposition lamed plus the infinitive construct can demonstrate a purpose, an intention, or a result of an action. In this case, we have the vav consecutive verb up front. They sat down. Well, why did they sit down? To eat bread. There you have the infinitive construct with the lamed preposition added to the front. Doesn't really translate the or change the translation value, but it does give you a contextual clue as to this being an action with a purpose, and this purpose is to sit down and eat bread. As I said, this is within the context of Joseph's brothers just discussed. They just threw him in the pit and are kind of plotting his demise and how they're going to inform their father of it when the caravans begins by and the idea of selling him into slavery pops in their mind. So even though we have a less violent verb here, the story is no less violent than my earlier example. You will also see cases where, and this was kind of the example that I gave earlier, that an infinitive construct can function as a simple verbal noun. And now here's a nice, pleasant one. To obey is better than sacrifice. Shema being a verb that can mean both hear or obey, but in this case, in the context of Samuel's writings here, and I believe this is related to some of Saul's ill deeds in attempting to sacrifice improperly. There we have to obey is better than sacrifice. If you want another callback to the previous lecture on prepositions, that's actually literally translated with that mem preposition that's fronting zebach, literally this would read, to obey from sacrifice is good. That's that comparative preposition that we looked at last lecture. So the way we translate it, to obey, is better than sacrifice. That was the infinitive construct, which is much more similar to the English infinitive. This is the infinitive absolute. It's the least common conjugation in the Hebrew Bible, and it's also the one that has no corollary in the English language. It's a odd form that you find in some Semitic languages, but not even in all of them. And it sometimes gives us a little bit of translation difficulty. Like the infinitive construct, no person, no number, no gender. And the other thing is, it will not take prepositions or pronominal suffixes. As we saw the infinitive construct, it's taking that lamed preposition. Infinitive absolute does not do that. It is always by itself. It'll have a stem. It'll be kal, nifal, pl, hifil. But infinitive absolute, bam, we're done with our conjugation. This is the most common way we see the infinitive absolute used. It's very distinctive for biblical Hebrew. The infinitive absolute itself occurs about 850 times in the Hebrew Bible. Not that many. This is about over half, about 500 times. It is used in this way right here, and it is doubling that noun there. In Genesis 2:17, a passage we've looked at several times in our slideshows, we have the imperfect verb there in black, tamoth, meaning you will die. That is a kal imperfect to masculine singular from the root moth there. But if we add a verb of the same root, mem, vav, tav, and we put it in the infinitive absolute in front of that verb, it makes that verb more emphatic. It makes that verb more intense. It makes the action that is being described here that much more certain. So in this case, Genesis 2:17 is not you will die, you will surely die, or you will certainly die. And so it's a more emphatic way of stating it. One grammarian said that when this expression is used, there can be no doubt. No one can come back and say that the speaker was not being clear enough. And so this is a distinctive, and oftentimes, if you come across this in a passage, an important thing to point out. Those are our two infinitives. The participle is the last thing we're looking at. It is a verbal adjective. We did not spend a whole lot of time on adjectives just because Hebrew does not use them extensively. It does, however, use participles a good deal. And so we're going to take that kind of limited time. If you need to go back and review the adjectives, that video is already up there to kind of review the three categories that we talked about, the adjectives function in, the attributive, the predicative, and the substantive. And we're going to apply those to the participle as well. English participles, typically you add ing to the end of a word. That's an English participle. Because they're verbal adjectives in Hebrew, they're inflected like adjectives. And if you remember, adjectives were inflected like nouns. So they're not inflected for person, but they are inflected for number and gender. Masculine singular, masculine plural. Feminine singular, feminine plural. And that is our paradigm right there. Just rehashing the fact that it functions as adjectives do. We'll look at these three examples. Here's an attributive participle. The Lord your God is a consuming fire. And in the Hebrew there, you see Yahweh, Eloheka, Ish, Akla, or Okla. Excuse me. And there you've got the subject, Yahweh, your God. A fire is a consuming one. Ish is the word for fire. There in our red is our participle. Ish is a feminine noun, and so the participle there matches it by being a feminine singular participle, and because it matches in number and gender and definiteness, it becomes attributive. So that becomes a consuming fire. You'll notice that consuming there, the root there, aleph, kaf, lamed, we saw that verbal root a little bit earlier in the infinitive construct, to eat. So that root actually means to eat. The Lord your God is a eating fire, a consuming fire, a devouring fire. And there it is in the participle being used attributively, modifying the word fire. We can also have a participle be predicative. Here we have Samuel lying down. This is a verbless clause. There you have Samuel, it opens with a vav conjunction. That's not being translated there in this context, but Samuel was lying down. That's just how a participle is used. That's the verb for to lie down, and it is being predicative there because it is not definite. Samuel, as a proper noun, is definite. So this verbal adjective matches in number, matches in gender, does not match in definiteness, so it becomes predicative. So we add that is, or that to be verb there. We add it past tense, in this case was, because it was part of a narrative. Last way to look at this, and this will happen quite often, is a participle can become a substantive, which means we have this in English all the time. A baker bakes, and so we have a substantive built off a verb there. To bake, well, who's the one that bakes? The one that bakes is a baker. You know, the one that judges is a judge. Well, what is the one that spies? They're a spy. And here's Joseph's kind of facade that he puts in front of his brothers when they come down to buy grain in Egypt. They have not recognized them yet, recognized their long-lost brother yet, and so he accuses them of being spies, and he does that with a participle. This is another one of those verbless clauses. Atem is the second person masculine plural pronoun, and so there, and we've got the participle highlighted in there in red, and so it's spies you are. You are ones that spy. That is a substantive, a verbal adjective, a participle that is in the masculine plural, used in the as a essentially as a noun there, by being a substantive verbal adjective. Those were all active participles, as you saw consuming, you saw spying, you saw lying down. Those are all active actions. The participle also has a plural form, or excuse me, a passive form. If you make note of it, it's just a shurick has been dropped in the middle there. So there's the masculine singular, plural, feminine singular, feminine plural, and that makes these. So instead of ones doing the killing, it is the ones being killed. It flips that from an active verb to a passive. We'll see examples here. Functions the exact same way. Attributively, he rebuilt all of the broken wall. All of the wall that had been broken. The wall didn't do the breaking. We're describing this wall as a thing that had been broken. Brokenness had happened to it. It had not been doing the breaking. That is the passive voice there. Likewise, there's the predicative use. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, or to truly make it a predicate there, it would be he who comes in the name of the Lord is blessed. He's not doing the blessing. The one who is coming in the name of the Lord is being blessed. He is receiving blessing. He is not actively blessing. He is receiving blessing. And lastly, we see this substantival use of a passive participle in Isaiah. Probably the most rare instance we see, but this is ones who are slain. They are not doing the slaying. They are the ones being slain. And and so that is in the passive as well. That concludes this presentation.